All right, welcome back. This is the Something Venture podcast. I am Kent Lindstrom. I'm your host. My guest today is Jerry Colonna. Thank you for doing this.
Oh, thanks for having me, Kent.
This is going to be a bunch of fun. So I'll just start out. Jerry started his career as a bit of a master of the universe, which is kind of an old phrase from Tom Wolfe. But
that's right. That's a good reference.
Right?
Yeah.
A venture capitalist in New York, along with Fred Wilson, starts an iconic venture firm called Flatiron Partners. Works at JP Morgan Partners, where he's also a top dog, and leaves that chapter at some point. How these two chapters connect, I think, is what's interesting. And then is co-founder and CEO of Reboot, which is an executive coaching and leadership company, but not what you think. Writes the book Reboot, Leadership and the Art of Growing Up, and is a Buddhist with a reputation for making people cry.
I do. That's right.
It is, and as I prepared for this podcast, I talked to some previous people about Bill Campbell, another coach. And I was imagining he would like throw things at people. And so when I heard him make people cry, I'm like, oh, he's a really tough guy. But that's not what you mean at all, is it?
No.
So how did you become such a successful venture capitalist? Every time on one of these podcasts, somebody's a venture capitalist, you say, wow, how'd you find this job? And the answer is always, I fell into it. And of course, the irony is they fell into it from Stanford or Harvard or some very elite place. Usually a father or a roommate is involved. But you didn't come into this. That's not your background. You didn't have that fancy
That's right.
Silicon Valley background, did you?
No, not at all. Happy to tell that story, but I need to say two things. One, I was a huge admirer of Bill's. I did not know him personally, but I was aware of his work. Yeah. Very different styles between he and I. And there's, the Buddha once said there are 84,000 doorways to the Dharma. Yeah. Just pick one. So he had one doorway, I had another.
He spoke of, and I never met him either, and the stories sound... I'll say this very carefully, kind of sometimes sound ridiculous, like he threw a green eye shade at somebody, but these very important people spent a lot of time out of their lives to write a book about him. And if you read the book and you talk to them, for example, Alan Eagle, who's a big executive at Google, he speaks often, Bill Campbell spoke often of love.
Right.
The topic of, once you get past the throw in the eye shade and the kind of fun stories, the love comes out, and their depth of feeling for him came out.
Right.
So while there may be different pathways, it seems like there's that consistency, perhaps.
Well, I think that, first of all, I need to quote something that someone once said to me just a few weeks ago. They described me as the love child between Bill Campbell and Pema Chodron, the Buddhist nun, which I really like.
Yeah, business cards made up, man. That's good.
I think that, again, I don't know Bill. I did not know him personally, except at a distance. But I think that people misunderstand love. I think that people misunderstand grace. And people misunderstand strength. And I think that they confuse all those things. And they think that love is weak and that strength must be aggressive. And that's actually not grace. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is smack somebody upside the head.
Yeah. And
sometimes the most strong thing that you can do is hold yourself steady while they break down. And that, to me, is grace. And so I have not thrown in green eye shade at anybody, but I am unafraid to say to somebody, whether it's a reporter on CNN, which I did on camera, on interview, or to a client more often, that's fucking bullshit. Yeah. That thing that you just said. Yeah. And I love you, and you know that I love you, and you trust me, and so trust me when I tell you that's bullshit. Yeah. And that doesn't sound like love. But trust me, that's love.
Right.
Because what's not love is to allow somebody to trip over their own wires and smash their face into the floor because they don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, it's amazing to hear how moved people are, how executives are. So my parents, my mother, was a Buddhist.
See, 5 minutes in and you're already talking about your parents.
Oh,
That's my level with me.
God damn it. Was a Buddhist, actually. And I think Bob Thurman was like her favorite person in the world. Do you know who?
I do know Bob. Talk about fierce.
Yeah. And so she became eventually of some branch of it, like actually an ordained minister. I separately get in, so I'm raised that way, separately get into business and then become that other thing, that really tough and intense person. But then as I start doing this podcast, the number of people who are very successful, who kind of speak intimately about failures and depression, love in the case of Bill Campbell, has sort of shocked me that undercurrent has been there the whole time as I've been like trying to attain the master of the universe status that I was obviously influenced by when I read the book by Tom Wolfe.
I suspect that you are carrying, or were carrying, because it now feels like it's in transition, the same perhaps misunderstanding that I carried, which was that these things are in opposition to each other. That to be whole and true, T-R-U-E, true, somehow is in opposition to being a master of the universe. Or more, and I think that stems from the personas that we assume when we step into what we believe we need to be a financial genius or to be a venture capitalist, or and I went through the same kind of shock and discovery. It's like the further I leave my own sense of self, the worse I performed. And I don't just mean like I was a jerk. I mean my return on investment was poor.
Right.
Whereas the more I moved towards what was true for me, conversely, or unexpectedly, the better my performance.
And how did you come to that? So the venture capital firm that you started is a venture capital firm. It's one of the big, successful, iconic ones. Like, why? Why could you do that? You didn't go to Harvard or Stanford or Princeton, the three places that everyone seems to cite, with an MIT once in a while.
Right. With reluctance, the MIT one. Not just kidding.
Exactly. Or school
like
in Boston.
School,
if they're being,
exactly.
I went to Northwestern.
Right.
That's what.
But notice nobody mentions Yale.
It's weird.
Yeah, it's really
There's
weird.
like one, Matt Kohler went to Yale, a benchmark partner. But anyway.
Yeah. So let me back up and note that Flatiron was actually my second venture firm. My first venture firm, I was a co-founder of a firm called CMG Ventures.
Sure.
And that spun out of a company called CMGI. And back in 95, we were launching that. And we kind of didn't know what we were doing, but that's okay. And then I left that after about 14 months. Interestingly, one of my partners in CMG Ventures was a guy named Dan Nova, who went on to great success at Highland Capital. And I haven't talked to Dan in many, many years, but I still consider him a friend. So I think what you're asking is, how does a guy with a BA in English from Queens College, City University of New York, end up a venture capitalist with a guy who actually had an undergraduate degree from MIT and an MBA from Wharton, which is one of the acceptable schools.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Right. So yeah, like a lot of your guests, I will say I fell into it, but it was a very specific story. I was working at a magazine publishing company called CMP Media at the time. This is I worked there for a long time, but this was in 1994. And I was, through a series of different moves within that company, eventually in charge of what was then called electronic media, which when I took the job meant petroleum products. It meant publishing statically PDFs on, I'm embarrassed to say this, CD-ROMs, right?
Like magazines used to have a CD-ROM in them sometimes, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, and we used to call this electronic. And then eventually I changed the name to interactive media, but it wasn't actually particularly interactive.
Right.
And in the spring of that year, Mark Andreessen was a graduate student at the University of Illinois, and he developed, he and a team of folks developed this thing called a browser. And when I saw that and was first, because previously the only way we used the internet was really to FTP files. These are things that like our young folk have no idea what I'm talking about, or to do a Waze search. Yeah. But to actually publish, to use this as a platform to publish information was just radical and new. And we, the team and I, put together a very quick show daily in April of 1994. And we would publish one article at a time, put it up, take it down, put it up, take it down. And so I argue that we may have published the first daily newspaper out there. Anyway, the summer, I was at a dinner with a guy from Microsoft, a guy named Russ Siegelman, and I was talking to him one day about the problems with what was then called, here's an old term, proprietary online service.
Whoa.
Right? And this was a service where you would dial in. So America Online, CompuServe, here's an old name, Delphi. Wow. And AT&T was developing something. Our rivals in publishing, Ziff Davis, was developing something. And of course, Microsoft was developing what became MSN. And I talked about the problem with all of them, which was that there was no way that you could access the internet. And they said, well, wait a minute, it all runs on the protocol. So I said, yeah, but you think everything's within your walls, in the walled garden. The more interesting stuff is outside the walled garden. Mm-hmm. And that conversation then led to me being recruited to come run content for MSN in the summer of 1994. Which would have meant moving from Long Island to Seattle, and it was a very complicated situation. And I was sort of struggling because I did not want to stay at CMP for the rest of my life, but it was a complicated story. So one day, I'm sort of in the midst of this, and I get this phone call from Dave Weatherall, who had just launched a company called Internet, I'm blanking on the name. Anyway, yeah. He had a browser, and he's like, you sound distracted. What's going on? I said, all right, I'll tell you. I've got this job offer from Microsoft, and I don't know if I want to do this. And he said, life-changing advice. He said, fuck Microsoft. I said, excuse me?
A lot of people have said that, but yeah.
Yeah. And so I said that, and then he said, you can turn them down. You can come work for me. So I thought about that for a while. We went ahead and we launched a product at Comdex that fall called TechWeb. And after launching TechWeb and it being perceived as success, and it was like the third entity to sell advertising on the web, I decided to leave CMP and I joined Dave Weatherall to be one of the founding partners of CMG Adventures. And that's how I got into the venture business.
And that's the path.
And that was the path.
How far ahead do you think you... Because I remember the first time I saw the internet, I was blown away by the physicality of the concept of sitting in San Diego and dialing into a computer, which you don't have this sense anymore, dialing into a computer in Minnesota and controlling,
right.
Looking up a file.
Right.
And just thinking, that's crazy, I'm here. And now you
right.
the hell knows where your searches are going all over the web.
Right.
That was just mind-blowing.
It was mind-blowing.
I certainly didn't see ahead to anything. I mean, eventually social networking, I became a part of that, and now I can call a car on my phone. But
right.
Did you imagine how big it would get, or did you imagine something?
I do imagine. I wouldn't say that I was as prescient as I might have been or might have wished I was, but I did see the potential. I remember, for example, there's a guy named Bob Davis, and Bob's a terrific guy, and he was the first CEO we hired to launch a company called Lycos,
Sure.
Lycos.
Yeah.
And again, Lycos was the first search engine.
Yeah.
And it was based on a web crawling technology, and Lycos is the name of a wolf spider, and the whole idea was that it spidered the web.
Yeah.
And we had, at Ventures, we had licensed that technology out of CMU, Carnegie Mellon, and formed a company, and Dan had recruited Bob to come. And I remember walking the show floor at the Heinz Convention Center with Bob Davis at an internet world show.
Yeah.
Right? Which I think you could fit all of the companies who were then working on internet-related things, in a garage floor.
Sure.
So we're walking the show, and he says to me, "Oh, come on. Do you really think people are going to sell advertising on the web? Come on. I mean, what's the most that's going to happen? $100 million a year, $200 million a year? I mean, what is this, Yellow Pages?"
Yeah.
And I looked at him and I said, "Bob, this is the future. This is the future of media. This is the future of our interactive experiences. This is the way it's going to be. We're going to connect." Now, I did not, it was one of my first investments was a company called GeoCities,
Sure.
which arguably was one of the first sort of social networking kinds of experiences. We used to talk about it being, we went from a world in which we published one to many to one to one to many, mm-hmm. which is the way we used to think about social networking in that way. And I remember sort of looking at that and being blown away at the level of intimate connection between small fragments of community across that was not time or geolocation dependent. And it was extraordinary.
You also had the kind of changing ethos of, early on, the people who were really into the internet had that concept that it shouldn't be necessarily used for commercial purposes.
Yeah, that was a big problem.
So I have a friend who was very early in the internet, and so think about a domain. Like you could get the domain business.com,
mm-hmm.
but you wouldn't, because it wasn't cool. Like if you weren't going to use the domain,
mm-hmm.
you wouldn't go. Whereas later, of course, people would come on
cyber-squatting,
and grab thousands of things like that.
Right.
And the ethos was also like, hey man, if you were on a discussion board and somebody's like, hey, I've got a record player to sell you, it'd be like, hey dude, not not cool.
Right.
So you also forget that ethos had to just change for Amazon.com to eventually become obvious to all of us.
Yeah, you're making me recall so much of what we take for granted right now is actually born out of the work in the 70s and the 80s. People like Stuart Brand, and the Whole Earth Catalog, and The Well, and the sense of community that was outside the realms of the more commercial enterprises like Delphi and AOL and CompuServe. And these were people who were really committed to the preservation of a notion of community. And, if you think back to John Perry Barlow and Electronic Frontiers Foundation, people who were really concerned, much of that got corrupted and twisted. The impulse behind the Electronic Frontiers Foundation, which was really about the preservation of truth and accuracy and the protection of privacy, there's a strain of that may have found expression in WikiLeaks.
Right.
And the original impulse is to protect WikiLeaks before we came to understand the ways in which it had been manipulated.
Yeah.
It's kind of heartbreaking to think about the best of human impulses being manipulated for the worst of our impulses.
Yeah. Well, in so many, there's, sometimes you can push the analogies too far, but there's the idea that back in the 60s and 70s, a lot of people left San Francisco to form communes. They were going to screw the man. Vietnam is this horrible military industrial grind. They go off the grid. And they found it kind of hard. Like it's kind of hard for 30 people to survive in the wilderness. And they would come back to San Francisco and see this thing, the internet, and that kind of looked to them to be a little bit like the thing that they were trying to create out in the Arizona desert. And so some of that ethos from the 60s kind of poured into it a little bit.
Absolutely.
But here we are today. So how do you come to know Fred Wilson and do this extraordinary firm?
So I met Fred over a deal. I was working for CMG at the time, and Fred was working at a venture firm in New York called Euclid Partners. And two fellows, Sunil Paul and Mark Pincus, had come together to form a company called Freeloader. And this was back in the day when people thought they would sell advertising on screensavers. So remember that?
Yeah, yeah.
So, your computer would power down, a screensaver would come up, and you'd get an ad for Coke or something.
Yeah.
This was a hot business category for about 3 months.
Yeah.
Anyway, I knew Sunil from my days at CMP. He was working at AOL. And Fred knew Mark. I don't remember where. But anyway, we met both simultaneously looking at funding Freeloader. He ended up doing the deal. Mark got into an argument with some of my partners at CMG. That deal on my side fell apart. But Mark and I stayed in contact. And one day Mark called me up, as he often did, even though I wasn't an investor, to seek and he would often call for advice. And one day he called to tell me that Fred was leaving Euclid and that he had secured funding and he was going to start a venture program and I should be his partner. I was like, that's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
And Mark knew that I was not happy with what I was doing at that point. And Fred and I met for lunch and, we decided to go into business together.
And it's such an incredibly successful firm. And it seems like such an incredible job, and yet you eventually move on from that. Mm. What animated you away from?
I'll try to keep it brief. In short, a lifelong relationship with depression had caught up to me.
Yeah.
And I was 37, turning 38, and we use term before Masters of the Universe. I felt like a master of the universe. I felt like I remember New York Magazine had written a story about Fred and I, and they called us the Princes of New York.
There you go. Yeah.
And I felt a sham. I felt an imposter. I felt that the more I doubled down on what was successful activity, the more distance I felt with my true sense of self. And to the point where in February 2002, after 9/11, after the attacks, after my life, after we had decided to shut down Flatiron Partners, I decided I was really grappling with suicidal feelings. Yeah. And fortunately, instead of killing myself, I was seeing a therapist at the time, continued to see her for many years later, but took her advice and went on a retreat and took the right fork, if you will.
Yeah. Did the success but is the contrast important? Recently, because I think a lot of people I've had struggled with moments of depression, and so you think you understand it a little bit. But recently, when Anthony Bourdain commits suicide, and I know there's a new way to say that's not commit suicide. I forget what it is, but I had that thought of, but wait, he is so successful. He's got kids. Lovely job. And of course, that I know better, but that was my thought. Like, oh, you've got so much going for you. How can you also? How can you be that depressed that you take your life? Was it that you got to being the Prince of New York, and you're like, well, if I'm not happy now, the contrast is what's breaking me. I got the
sure,
thing
that's an
aspect.
Yeah. Again, we're both old enough to remember phrases like the brass ring, right? Yeah. So the brass ring was what you would reach out for when you were on the merry-go-round, and if you got the brass ring, you got a prize, right? So as you're passing, you grab the brass ring. And I often would say I had the brass ring in my hand, and I still didn't feel better. Yeah. And but it would be incomplete for me to say that that was the only reason. That was an aspect of it. Another aspect was that I felt that the inner version of me and the outer version of me were not in sync. That's an aspect of it. I would also be unfair if I just limited it at that. And the truth is, as I said before, I've had a lifelong relationship with depression. As I detail in my book, it was a challenging childhood, and it challenged my sense of worthiness, my sense of lovability, my sense of feeling safe, and all of those things. I had previously struggled with depression in my teen years. I had a suicide attempt at 18. Yeah. And in my 30s, it came back with a vengeance for a whole bunch of complicated reasons, not merely that I was successful. Now, that said, this phenomena that you identified, which is right, in thinking about Anthony Bourdain, what I would caution people to do or to be wary of is please do not think that you understand someone's insides because you see what their outside is. And that actually exacerbates the depression, because on the inside, I can imagine that Anthony Bourdain struggled with feelings of unworthiness that go back to his childhood. And I think it's very, very rare that any decision to take one's life is made impulsively. It happens, but I think it's more a function of a long period of relationship with these darker feelings. And my teacher and friend, Parker Palmer, likes to say that violence is what we do when we don't know what to do with our suffering. Mm. And so when we see someone committing an act of violence against someone else or an act of violence against themselves, try to see the suffering.
Right. Yeah, I had the author of Lost in Startuplandia on the podcast, talking about its whole book about depression in Silicon Valley. And she'd gone through all these different things, is now amazingly successful. And one of the things that she points out happens here is that not only people who become entrepreneurs, according to her, some study at Berkeley, are actually 2 or 3 times more likely to suffer from depression and anxiety, why ever that correlation happens. And the ethos of Silicon Valley and entrepreneurship and in New York as well is that everybody is just killing it, crushing it, things are going great. And of course, half the people are lying. Right. But if you're already
90%.
Yeah, right.
Not half.
If you're already in that state of, oh, I'm unworthy, boy, are you in an environment where everyone else is telling you, yeah, that sounds right, because we're rocking and winning and amazing.
I think that's right. You made reference to my reputation for making people cry. And it's a joke now, right? I mean, but the truth is it does happen. And what I often point out is I don't set out to make people cry. I actually set out to make people slow the fuck down and feel. And oftentimes what they feel is the falsity of, I'm crushing it. Because the truth is, nobody's got it figured out. Yeah. Everybody's making shit up every single day. And even the people that look, I've been in San Francisco now for a couple of days. I've met with 3 different billionaires. Okay? They're all struggling. Right? Yeah. So they're at the pinnacle, right? If you look on the outside and you project onto them and you say to yourself, everybody's doing great, except that they're not. And because this being human is hard. And the problem with the mythology of hustle porn is it does not create space for human beings. And look, I'm a fan of companies succeeding. It's great. It's wonderful. It creates jobs. It creates economic prosperity. It creates all sorts of opportunity. But for God's sake, can we take a little edge off? Yeah. Can we take a little bit off that and say, not everybody needs to bust through walls, create a 100x return. Sometimes it's good enough to build a company that just generates profit.
Right.
And provides jobs. Like, how awesome is that?
Right. Right.
If
you lose, I guess, the imposter syndrome or loss of self-esteem, I think was the topic of one of the chapters in the book. Is there a way to use that to move yourself forward, to bring success out of it? Is there, what is the path forward if you're like, you are good enough, but you just don't feel it?
Right.
Every room you sit in, you're like, man, that guy's a billionaire, and I've got, whatever, debts. And
yeah, I think you're referring to the chapter in which I talk about the crow.
Yes.
Yeah, and the crow is a term that a poetry teacher, writing teacher in college gave me to describe she described it as the crow who sits on your shoulder telling you that every word you write sucks. And for me, the crow became a symbol for that voice in my head that tells me everything I do is bullshit, right? Even this conversation. Yeah. If I listen to it, I can hear, what are you talking about? Right. And so what I often talk about is the first impulse is oftentimes to shoot the fucking crow. And I tried to do that. And the truth is that I came to understand that voice that tells you you're an imposter is actually trying to protect you. It's trying to protect you from shame. It's trying to protect you from somebody walking down the street, pointing their finger at you and saying, you don't know what you're doing, and we can all see it.
Boy, that is exactly the feeling.
That's the feeling, right?
Yeah.
And so it's trying to protect you. Wait, that changes the whole equation.
Right.
Because when that voice is trying to protect you, it loves you.
Right.
It's just showing its love in a perverse way. It's not unlike the parent who says to you, out of love, what, you only got a 98?
Right.
What happened to the other 2 points? Yeah. Right? Because the wish there is only for you to feel good about yourself. The problem is that it's using that impulse in a way that actually only exacerbates the problem. And so what I advise is to turn around, face that crow, blow it a kiss, tell it thank you, but thanks very much, but I don't need you right now.
Oh, yeah.
Because I got this.
Yeah.
I am no longer in danger of being humiliated. Because if somebody says something bad to me, I'll punch them in the nose. I'm teasing,
right.
But not by much.
Right.
You see what I'm trying to do?
Yeah.
Right? So it's not this kind of Nietzschean, that which does not kill me, make me stronger, machismo bullshit. It's actually to see more clearly the move that's going on. And what's going on is, hey, I'm really afraid, says one part of your mind. I'm really afraid that we are going to feel terrible. So I'm going to make you feel terrible so that you don't feel terrible. Wait a minute. That's a 5-year-old's logic.
Yeah.
I don't need to think that way.
How did you get yourself across this divide? You read, you meditate.
A journal.
Yeah. How does journaling work? What do you write down? I know lots of successful people do it.
I've been journaling since I was 13.
Okay, wow.
And it's a foundational part of who I am.
Yeah.
And nearly every journaling session begins with some form of answering the question, how do I feel right now? Yep. As I, later on in my life, I developed a meditation practice. I found my way to Buddhism. And of course, I read constantly. But every one of those things I put in the bucket of this sort of mindful awareness of who I am and what's going on for me. Yeah. Not in a narcissistic do loop, if you will, but in a kind of level setting, beginning my day. Okay, how the fuck am I doing right now? I joked before about getting people to slow down and therefore cry. The magic question that I ask people is, how are you? no, really, how are you?
Yeah.
Right? And so if you think about journaling and you think about my morning ritual, all I'm doing is asking myself, how am I?
Yeah.
No, really. Stop bullshitting. Stop pretending. Stop crushing it.
Right.
Like, how am I doing? And so there are many journal entries that begin with, I'm struggling.
Wow.
I'm having a hard time. And then I write to myself. I talk with myself. And I listen to the various voices within myself. When it gets really hard, I might use 2 different pens to have a dialogue with myself.
Wow.
So that I am in relationship with my mind.
Yeah.
Which, any experienced meditator will tell you that's what's actually happening on the cushion.
And how are you doing now?
I'm well. I'm in the middle of this post-book launch time period, and it's super, super busy. I am feeling affirmed and dazzled by the reactions that I'm receiving. I'm finding I had prepared myself, I thought, for the consequences of exposing myself. I get pretty intimate. But I had not prepared myself for the degree to which people from various walks of life would reach out to me and tell me their stories and see in my story their story. Right? I had a man write to me a few weeks ago who told me that he had spent 6 months planning his suicide. And then he read my book and decided to get a therapist instead.
Wow.
I've had women in their 70s. A woman grew up in Oklahoma City who stopped me at a co-working space where I was doing a talk a few weeks ago. And, she grew up, her parents survived the Dust Bowl, and she looked at me and she said, your story is my story.
Yeah.
Right? I was not prepared for the resonance with which people would respond to what I wrote.
Yeah. I'm not surprised. I think a lot of people are suffering, and just somebody saying, hey, that's okay, or yeah, that's happened to other people is a big deal.
I think if I can add to that, I think somebody who is an object of projections, like I can be an object of people's projections where people presume they understand who I am and paint a whole story around someone like me. Oh, he's successful, or he's this, or he's that. For that person who has power and privilege as a consequence of those projections, for that person to stand up there and say, I'm going to raise my hand and be honest, it's a struggle, creates this space for other people.
Yeah.
And that, by the way, is one of the most important lessons of my book, is when a leader is willing to stand up and say, this is hard, it all of a sudden magically creates space for other people within the organization to say, hey, I'm having a hard time too. And I'm not just talking about depression. I'm talking about like, I don't know how to finish this code, or I don't know how to ask for help, or I'm not going to make this sales number, and we stop all of the bullshitting that tends to go on within an organization. I can't tell you the number of times, Kent, where I or my colleagues get called into an organization and they say to us, we have a trust issue. And I'll sit there and I'll say, well, are you telling the truth? It's like, oh, no, we can't tell the truth. We don't trust each other enough to tell the truth. It's like,
yeah.
Right?
Okay, I think, yeah. So I'll ask you maybe one more thing. Why, so you, as you heal yourself and go through this process, how then do you come to say, what I want to do is build a company that helps other people?
Well,
it seems like enough work to do your own self.
There was an interim step, which was me on my own, right?
Yeah.
And me as a solo entrepreneur, walking gingerly and tentatively into the seat of a coach and being a coach. And what I often came to and then the entrepreneur in me came in and it's like, okay, this doesn't scale.
Right, yeah, there you go.
And I still have a bunch of VC friends who are like, how can we put money? It's like, stop,
Of course.
But really the issue is that, and I often say this, the motivation and why I do what I do is to retroactively go back in time and save myself from the feelings that I had when I was 38.
Yeah.
And the truth is, I encounter people who have the same feelings that I had. And I'm not just talking about suicide or depression. Everybody likes to fixate on those. I'm talking about just a basic sense of unworthiness, the basic sense that I am failing, and the sense of ennui that can come in when you have the brass ring in your hand and you realize that's all there is. That hasn't shifted.
Yeah.
That internal dialogue.
And what is the feeling when you talk to a billionaire or an executive who's struggling? You come in, and I read what they say later. That guy's some version of saved my life, saved my company, made my company. Mm. Is it the feeling? Does that give you a feeling that motivates you to do this?
I'll answer that question this way. A few years back, I was on Dan Harris's podcast. Dan does the 10% Happier podcast. And he asked me about my path of meditation. And I said, I kind of don't give a rat's ass about enlightenment. Huh. Like, I don't sit on the cushion to be enlightened. I sit on the cushion because fucking life hurts. Yeah. And what motivates me, I'm a first responder when it comes to suffering. And to me, suffering is universal. And, you know, the Buddha taught something called the interdependence of all beings, which is this notion that my happiness is tied up with your happiness, my suffering is tied up with your suffering, and that we as human beings are called to move towards the alleviation of suffering. And that in doing so, we alleviate our own suffering. Think of suffering as just sort of an energetic field that exists in the world, and that our job is to dial that down. Yeah. Whether it's the suffering of the planet or suffering of non-human beings or suffering of beings. And a funny, magical thing happens. When you dedicate yourself to compassionately alleviating the suffering of others, you feel better.
Yeah. This is great. I want to finish. Can I read the last line of that poem that we talked about?
Sure.
So this poem by Mary Oliver, you talk about, and so the whole poem it's about birds, but it's very sad. Right. Birds who are moving on to the next stage, migrating, going places with ambitions as birds have them, die and never get to that place. And the poem ends with these two lines. It says, "I tell you this to break your heart, by which I mean only that it break open and never close again to the rest of the world."
Amen. Yeah. So the poem is called Lead by Mary Oliver, and she opens up by describing coming across a loon dead on the side of a lake. And anybody who's heard the call of the loon knows how tragic and sad it is. And that last line is the point of the poem. And that last line, and the reason you called it forth is because in a way it inspired one of the chapters in the book, which is that heartbreak is something we fear so much, but implicit in heartbreak is heartbreaking open.
Right.
And so much of our life is organized around protecting ourselves from heartbreak. That entrepreneur who stands up at some sort of bullshit TechCrunch disrupt party to say, I'm crushing it, is just trying to protect themselves from heartbreak. And so what the late, great Mary Oliver is saying is, allow your heart to break open. Let it happen. Because in letting your heart break open, you open to the fullness of joy. You open to the fullness. See, I don't see that poem as sad. I see that poem as recognizing the truth of the world. Yeah. So that you can then live in a space not of false happiness and pleasure, but of deep and profound equanimity.
It's beautiful. Well, this has been great. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I love the conversation.
My guest has been Jerry Colonna. The book that you should read is Reboot, Leadership and the Art of Growing Up. Thanks so much.
Thank you.